Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and it is Friday, so it's time for another MTG Top 10. This week we're looking at Golems. In last week's poll, I gave everyone an option between two creature types, humans and Golems. Golems had managed to come in second on two previous polls, so I brought it back. And this time it won. I can't say I was expecting that, as humans are a much more supported tribe than Golems are. They're also sort of pretty relevant right now, at least in Modern. But Golems are one of my favorite creature types in Magic, so I'm pretty happy to do a video about them. Golems actually have an interesting history, and talking about them is one of the few places where my interests in magic and my soon-to-be awarded PhD in Jewish history align. Golems originally come from 16th century Jewish folklore and were creatures that were made of clay and animated by rabbis, according to these stories, in times of need for the Jewish community. The duty of these golems was to protect the Jewish community in times of persecution. They have gone on to become a major part of the fantasy genre in general, where they generally appear as large creatures made out of metal or rock, usually made by a wizard, and Magic is no exception. Golems aren't the most plentiful creature type in Magic. There's only 118 cards printed that either have the Golem creature type or that make Golem creature tokens, but clearly, based on last week's poll, they are a pretty popular creature type. In this video, we're going to talk about the 10 Golems in Magic's history that have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic. To be eligible for this list, a card either needed to have the Golem creature type or create Golem creature tokens. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I grade these lists. A Pro Tour top 8 or a Legacy or Vintage Championship top 8 is worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now let's go ahead and get started. At number 10, we have a Golem that is one of the most disheartening creatures in the game to see on your opponent's board, since it can end the game in one swing. Blight Colossus. Indestructible, Trample, and Infect is a nasty combination when coupled with an 11/11 body, and this card is one of the best cards in the game to cheat into play. Perhaps the best non-Eldrazi, non-Gristlebrand creature in the game to cheat into play. The standard environment of its day wasn't heavy with ramp or other cards to get creatures into play early, and as a result, he didn't see much play there. Formats with larger card pools are where he has been relevant, namely Legacy and Vintage. In Legacy, he sees play in mud decks that have ways to ramp into huge artifacts, as well as ways to cheat them into play. And in Vintage, he has seen play primarily in control decks where Tolarian Academy can cheat this Golem into play as a win condition. His most recent top 8 in Vintage was at the Vintage European Championship in 2017, and it wouldn't be surprising to see this Golem in the top 8 at the next Eternal event either. At number 9, we have the oldest card to make the list, and that is Sand Golem. While the 5-mana 3/3 isn't a great rate, even back in Magic's early days where creatures were weaker, the text box on this guy is actually quite powerful. If your opponent makes you discard him somehow, he comes back as a 4/4 for free. 0-mana 4/4s are pretty good. That's right, Hollow One isn't the first 0-mana 4/4 Golem to show up in a Pro Tour deck. It saw play in Block, a format which also included Stupor and Coercion, discard spells that the Sand Golem could feast off of, and also in Extended after it was printed, where even more powerful discard spells existed, namely Hymn to Turok. The Golem hasn't seen any play since 1999, and with Hollow One suddenly emerging as a relevant card in Modern, it may not be on this list much longer. At number 8, we have one of the two cards on this list who aren't creatures with the Golem creature type, but they make Golem tokens, and the first of these is Hammer of Purphoros. Part of the cycle of legendary enchantment artifacts from Theros block, each of which belong to one of the gods from that plane, Hammer of Purphoros gives all your creatures haste, and also has the ability to pump out Golem tokens for 3 mana, which effectively have haste too. If you make one at the end of your opponent's turn and one on your turn, you can suddenly be sending in 6 extra damage on your turn. Sure, you have to sacrifice a land, but it is a very efficient cost. It also helped that it existed in a format where the devotion mechanic was one of the most powerful things you could do, and the 2 red symbols this has in its mana cost help make it even more playable. It primarily saw play in aggressive devotion decks like Devotion to Red and Devotion to Boros, as well as Red Deck Wins, which is a devotionless aggro deck. In aggro decks, it was a really good way of making sure that if you ran out of gas, you could do something with your mana. It worked well in control decks too, though, and saw some play in Naya control decks as a result. It hasn't seen play since rotating out of Standard, and even failed to stay relevant the entire time it was in Standard, with the release of Karns block not being great for the Hammer. And it doesn't seem like a likely candidate to ever see play in non-rotating formats. At number 7, we have what is actually my personal favorite card of all time, Karns Silver Golem. It was the first rare I ever got in a booster pack, and I've loved the guy ever since. This is Karn before he was a Planeswalker, when he was still but a humble golem creature with a powerful text box. He wasn't great at attacking, since if anything blocked it, his power dropped to 0, but he turned into a 0/8 as a blocker and can turn artifacts into creatures for the absurdly low cost of a single mana. He first saw play in block, where he was pretty powerful because Urza's block was so focused on artifacts. He could turn your board into an army in a hurry. Standard wasn't his kind of Karn, where he only managed one world's top 8 and a wildfire deck in 1999. He also managed a single Grand Prix top 8 in Extended back in '05 in an artifact-heavy deck that focused on getting powerful artifacts out of the graveyard with Goblin Welder. More recently, though, Karn has found himself in vintage mud decks, so-called because the decks run a lot of old artifacts that have this old brown artifact frame that Karn has, and he has actually managed to pick up a vintage championship top 8 as recently as 2017. In these decks, Karn has the flexibility of not only turning artifacts into creatures, but also the dual utility of being able to turn 0-mana artifacts like the Moxes into 0/0 creatures, meaning that he can destroy them for only a single mana, and that is a pretty good deal. At number 6, we have a creature that is itself a golem, and it makes more golem tokens, and that is Precursor Golem. This card is really powerful because for 5 mana it gives you an insane 9/9 worth of stats. Now, it does come with a bunch of other text that says any instant or sorcery that targets one golem copies and targets all other golems, so one kill spell is enough to take all of these guys out, and any other golems you're running. Running other golems alongside this usually isn't a great idea. But still, that amounts to a 1-for-1. It isn't a huge blowout as it is if your opponent just doesn't have the kill spell. You're just going to kill them if they don't have it. You can also flip this the other way too, as it copies instants and sorceries you cast on your own golems too. For example, you can do this with pump spells, though in competitive play, that doesn't come up much. In Standard, the Golem saw a lot of play because it was such an efficient threat, primarily in Rug control and Grixis control, but being such an efficient threat meant that it worked in aggro decks too at the top of the curve, like mono-green aggro. Like Karn, Precursor Golem has found a second life in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage, where it has recently been played in Ravager Shop's deck. Decks that run a ton of artifacts in Mishra's Workshop, which allows for some very fast ramping for artifacts, and Arcbound Ravager, who can turn artifacts into +1/+1 counters. At number 5, we have our second golem, who is also a Colossus, and that is Phyrexian Colossus. By today's standards, this Colossus would not be anything special. A 7-mana 8/8 that is difficult to block is nice, but the fact that this thing can't untap without you paying 8 life is a pretty massive downside. But in Magic's earlier days, a 7-mana 8/8 was absolutely insane, and people found a way to get around the downside by using cards that could untap their artifacts or other permanents, effectively removing the card's downside. At the Urza's Block Pro Tour New York in 1999, the Colossus had a pretty great weekend, showing up in 5 of the top 8 decks in the tournament, who ran Voltaic Key and Ring of Gix to take advantage of mana rocks that help you get to 7 mana quickly, as well as the Colossus, so it synergizes pretty well. In the early 2000s in Standard and Extended, the Colossus shifted into decks that were capable of cheating it into play quickly with Tinker, which also ran various ways to untap the guy. From 1999 to 2003, this golem was one of the scariest creatures in the game thanks to his efficiency and evasiveness, but he eventually fell out of favor as much better fatties took its place. At number 4, we have a golem that likes blowing up lands, Sundering Titan. This guy brings a huge body with him that is also capable of nuking 5 lands when he comes into play, and 5 when he leaves play. In a world where lands have more than one land type, this isn't too hard to do. Sometimes he will take a land or 2 of yours with him, but usually you can take down more of your opponents since you get to choose the target. Especially because the deck where the Titan has seen the most success is in Tron decks, where the Tron lands can't actually be targeted, plus they help you ramp into him quickly. They run very few basic lands generally, Tron decks, so it's usually going to be pretty one-sided. In Standard, Tron wasn't around, and he only picked up 1 Pro Tour top 8 in the sideboard of an Astral Slide deck, which admittedly could do some pretty disgusting things with him since it could flicker him over and over again. In Extended, though, where he could be cast with the Tron lands, he put up most of his numbers in blue-white and blue-green Tron, which were for a time pretty dominant. After Extended ended in 2011 and Modern was born, he continued to see play there for a while in Tron decks, picking up 2 Grand Prix top 8s in them. But eventually those decks turned towards casting different huge monsters. In 2014, he even managed a top 8 in a Legacy Mud deck. What he does is so powerful that he even sees play in Vintage, having top 8 the Vintage Championship in 2014, and just missing out on a top 8 in 2015's Vintage Championship. He has seen play in subsequent Vintage tournaments, but has nearly missed out on the top 8 in the last few years, but there is a chance he could pick up a few more points. At number 3, we have the second card on the list that is not itself a golem, but it makes golem tokens, and that is Blade Splicer. In our return to Mirrodin, there was a whole cycle of Splicers printed who were all artificers who put 3/3 golem tokens into play. They all offered a Lord-like ability to Golems too, giving them all some bonus. In Blade Splicer's case, this was First Strike. The only Splicer to make the list, Blade Splicer was certainly the best of the bunch, as it gave you 4/4 worth of stats for only 3 mana, and 3 of it had First Strike, making it very difficult to block or attack through. It also comboed well with effects that blinked it like Restoration Angel, which was capable of giving you even more Golems. It first saw play in block artifact aggro decks that use Tempered Steel to give all of your artifact creatures +2/+2. In Standard, it saw play in Birthing Pod, where it was especially nice because you got to hang on to the Golem after you sacrificed the Splicer to the pod to move up the chain, and it also saw play in green-white aggro decks. It has found its way into some modern decks too, including blue-white mid-range, and more recently, Hate Bear decks, which it has managed to pick up 2 Grand Prix top 8s in as recently as 2017. It has a chance of putting up more points at 2018 Modern Grand Prix as well. At number 2, we have a Golem who is an invitational card, and one that is a staple in EDH in addition to its accomplishments in Magic's Pro Tours and Grand Prix, Solemn Simulacrum. I know it doesn't say Golem on the original printing of the card, but he has been errated to have the creature type. From 1997 to 2007, Wizards ran a tournament called the Magic Invitational Tournament, where the best players of the year were invited to a tournament, and one of the prizes for winning the tournament was getting to design a Magic card, which they would put your likeness on. Jens Thorin won the tournament in 2003, and he designed Solemn Simulacrum. This guy is all about value, allowing you to ramp your mana when he comes into play and drawing you a card when he dies. It's very difficult for your opponent to interact with him and come out ahead, as he is a card who is basically worth 3. The sheer value of the card was first realized at the Mirrodin Block Pro Tour Kobe in 2004, where it put up 6 Pro Tour top 8s in a variety of decks, ranging from ramp to aggro. There wasn't really a good reason not to be running the guy in block. Standard is where he saw the most play, though, where he is aided by also being reprinted in Magic 2012, giving him 2 shots at Standard. His first time through Standard was actually pretty quiet, though, managing only a single Pro Tour top 8. The second time through Standard, it saw play at an incredibly high rate. It fit perfectly into ramp decks, which were pretty good in Standard at the time. They were built around Primeval Titan and Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, and it also was right at home in Birthing Pod alongside Blade Splicer, who occasionally gave it First Strike, because you could get so much value out of it and then sacrifice it to the pod. It also has a lone Legacy Grand Prix top 8, put up back in 2005 at Grand Prix Lille. While it is pretty high on this list now, cards behind it that are still seeing play could threaten it in the future, as it is an unlikely candidate to find its way into any of the current non-rotating formats, though it could always be reprinted in another core set, and if it were, it would almost certainly see play in Standard again. And at number 1, we have a Golem that has proven powerful enough that it needed to be restricted in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage. Lodestone Golem brings some decent stats to the table, but his real value comes in the fact that he hoses people who aren't playing a deck filled with artifacts, making all non-artifact spells cost an additional mana. One of those cards that never really caught on in Standard or Block because there wasn't really an artifact deck there, Lodestone Golem hasn't seen play anywhere but Legacy and Vintage, and in Legacy it barely saw play, and its only top 8 is back in 2014 in a mud deck. Vintage is where it really earns its points though, and also why it got restricted there. Artifact-heavy decks in Vintage also followed the Mud model, and more recently Ravager Shops decks, which I mentioned earlier, have joined the party. Lodestone Golem was great in both, as both decks are made entirely of artifacts, and the Golem's effect becomes one-sided. It has had a lot of absurd finishes at Vintage Championships from 2014 and on, amassing 17 top 8s at such events in that time. Its superiority eventually led to it being restricted, though, as artifact-heavy decks were deemed too powerful. Still, it does see play as a singleton copy in those decks, where it is still managing to find top 8s. That does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe, and don't forget to vote in the poll for next week's topic. Also, if you want to help me continue to improve my channel, you can do so by following the Patreon link below. Thanks for watching.